All right, so we're going to be doing a little New Deal, a little Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and all that. The modern two-party system where the Democrats represent the state intervening on behalf of the disadvantaged starts in the 1930s. The Republicans, being the party of business, started in the 1920s, really. Before that time period, the parties were different. We shouldn't apply the same kind of notions. But if we were modern in the 1920s, the Democrats become the modern Democratic Party in the 1930s, and the size of the government grows incredibly in the same time period. So we're talking about the rise of the broker state, meaning that the government brokers in between the people and large corporations and other things of that nature. So let's start with Hoover, because the Great Depression begins in 1929. Under his administration, the government did more than it had ever done before. But the Depression was large and it needed considerably more input, so it doesn't really do that much for the overall Depression, although it's a pretty big change for the federal government in general. Here we go from 1930 to 1945, and what's striking is that percent of unemployed on relief goes from 10% to 44%. The caseload increases. The number of unemployed, however, goes down in the same time period. So we're seeing the impacts of the New Deal and what we call deficit spending, what John Maynard Keynes, the economist, gets associated with. We see the impact of that on the number of unemployed, but we also see the benefits provided by the state increasing, and so we see more people on the caseload. So in that way, the government is helping out these people in one way, it's helping out these people in another way, and it's providing for both the unemployed and those who have jobs, at least in the 1930s, for a lot of those jobs. 1932, FDR gets elected in a serious in a serious electoral landslide, an ass whooping, as I'd say. All Democratic states. Hoover is not doing enough, and the American people are wanting more done. There is also a big landslide in the House and the Senate. It gets bigger in the Senate later on, but it's fairly small in the Senate at first, but huge in the House, right? So the Republicans can do what they want. It's a hopeless situation. The Chamber of Commerce of this town says, get out of here. We can't help you. One of the big problems was a bank crisis. It had been going on, look at this, 1921, 1929, it had been going on in the 20s, but it's rural and it's agricultural western states. In the 30s, it changes and it starts hitting the cities and it starts hitting the eastern folks, and that's when the government gets freaked out. Yeah, so here's 1921, 1929, South and the West. All right, let's move forward. 1931, Chicago. Cities out here. I think that's like Pittsburgh, right? What do we got here? Philadelphia. We got all kinds of crazy stuff going on in the New York region. So, kind of a big deal. It's the near collapse of banking. So Roosevelt, in an unprecedented maneuver, closes all the banks. Of course, most of the banks were already closed, so it's not that big of a deal. But he calls a bank holiday, and then they reopen the banks. So under Roosevelt, we get the government doing things they hadn't done, but the situation was really quite bad. This is my joke. You see, he's talking to the radio, but he didn't talk to the radio. Okay, it's kind of a silly joke. Fireside chats, he uses microphones, and he talks through the radio to the American people. He talks to them in language they can understand. It's not complex. It's not radical. Actually, it was complex and radical, but he didn't tell them that. And then he says, it's no more your problem than my own. So he gets everybody together in this thing, right? There's an unbelievable amount of federal agencies that are created. When are they created? 1933. It's called the 100 Days. It's called the first sort of 2.5 months of, or 3 months of Roosevelt's administration, and we get a bunch of programs designed to put people back to work, to have middle class people keep their homes, to put people back to work. There's ag in here, there's farm credit in here, so ag's a big part of it. Commodity Credit Corporation, that's another ag thing. So we're addressing, labor is in here, we're addressing the needs of lots of different Americans. That's why we call it the broker state, because every different kind of constituency gets a government program, or at least that's kind of how it seems, right? Here's a big one. We're just going to talk about one example of this. FDIC still in effect, although Glass-Steagall has changed a little bit. But the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is still out there. It props up the system. It stops failure. It doesn't stop panics. All right, sorry. It doesn't stop failures, but it does stop panics. It reassures people. And so let's look at this. What do we have? Bank failures, 1933, 27%. And then after that, almost none. So the banking reform works really well. How about farm foreclosures? It doesn't work quite as well. It's a little more complicated. Let's see, what should we say? One of the ways to try and help farmers is they give new loans to help them get out of debt, and to help, not to help them get out of debt, but help them manage their debt. Oh boy, do we want to talk about this? Yeah, let's just say this. Rural America was suffering and had been suffering, and they are getting angry. They're calling for a national farmers' strike on May 13th, 1933. They're trying to withhold their products from the market until they can get better prices. Dun, dun, dun. May 12th, right, the day before this strike, Congress passes the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which basically helps farmers out. It pays them money. It establishes a standard of prices for a period. We're not going to get into it. Don't worry about it. You know, come for office hours. We can talk about parity if you want. But starts helping out farmers. Did nothing for sharecroppers. That's another story. Here's another big program that for rural America is huge. It takes a long time for it to actually develop electricity, but it creates rural electrification programs that put up power lines, that bring power to farms, and it is radical. All right, all kinds of good, positive infrastructural changes occur as a result of the New Deal. But then there are also people who get mad for lots of different reasons. All right, we should reference the fact that Hitler comes to power during the Great Depression in Germany. So it really shook other Western democracies to the core. Mussolini also comes to power during the Great Depression. So, Hitler, Mussolini, they're fascists. No matter what you say about America, we do not have a fascist leader. No matter what you say about FDR, he is no Hitler. So we get a bigger government, but we don't get the fascist government. Although we do have some fascists running around, right? The KKK is very much a fascist organization, if you're keeping track. Francis Townsend, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, all of these cats want the government to do more. The Kingfish, governor of Louisiana, Huey Long, he gets assassinated, so he doesn't run against Roosevelt, but he's calling for a 100% tax rate over $1 million, right? Really radical share the wealth, redistributive kinds of policies. Doesn't happen, but we do get Social Security. This is like a middle road between what some of the more radical programs wanted and what Congress was willing to do. There's employment parts of it. It doesn't affect all workers. Anyway, we're going to move on because we got other stuff to cover. The labor unions are helped out considerably by the New Deal. And so going into the 40s, we have a strong labor union, and we have lots of employed Americans making good, decent wages. Part of this is the Wagner Act, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but basically it increases the power of unions versus employers. Remember when Debs got thrown in jail for organizing a union? This gives the unions more power, and as a result, you get more union membership. 1936, Roosevelt's reelected. Huge mandate once again. Even bigger margin of victory in the Senate. So we're all all Democrat all the time. And here's where we're going to stop for just a minute and talk about John Maynard Keynes. My son is coming down the stairs. He's going to bug me. John Maynard Keynes is an economist. He's really important to the overall theory of the way the government works. And he says when you have a depression, no, government will be part of the solution. When no one else is spending, the government needs to be the spender of last resort. Republicans nowadays do not agree with this theory of government. Democrats still agree with this theory of government by and large. That's why for some the deficit is not that big of a deal as long as you pay it down, and that has been happening. The deficit has been being paid down. It's been anyway, in World War II and after World War II, we'll talk about the deficit a whole lot more. So Keynes is this really important theorist. Now, Roosevelt had already been doing deficit spending before Keynes publishes his theory on this, the general theory of employment, interest, and money. But Keynes gives it an imprimatur, gives it an official seal. Roosevelt unites a bunch of disparate groups. This is why we also call it the broker state. Farmers, labor unions, blacks, immigrants, women, city dwellers, all these people get a little something out of what Roosevelt changes the government into, with the help of Congress, of course. There are challenges to Roosevelt's program. It's found unconstitutional, the AAA is. Then Roosevelt says we should pack the Supreme Court. And this is a crazy story that we don't need to talk about too much, but basically this is the highest level of dictatorship that Roosevelt got. Note, interestingly, Roosevelt's walking up the stairs when he was crippled by polio, but then again, times were different and the news was a lot more kind back then. There's a huge negative response to Roosevelt's plan to increase the size of the Supreme Court, and it doesn't happen. But it's a real sort of dark stain on otherwise Roosevelt's rather successful period in office. Fair Labor Standards Act. This is the final piece of New Deal legislation, and look at this. We get a minimum wage, we get maximum hours, doesn't apply to ag, but finally in 1938 we get bread and butter unionism. So that's kind of a good thing. All right. We're going to end this one a little bit quicker than the other ones. We packed a whole lot in, and I'm just going to end with the same idea. And it was an idea that FDR wanted us to think about. It was an idea that the Federal Theater Project wanted us to think about. And that is, it didn't happen here. That under the Democratic Party, fascism was not allowed to take root. And that's an important thing, right? This is a big test of democracy around the world. The Great Depression and the depths of poverty and the depths of need. So, all right, I'm going to end with that. I'm just going to say that at least FDR wasn't Hitler, and that's a little lighthearted silliness, of course. So have a good time out there in the internet world, and we'll see you again real soon.